one genre of story that I've enjoyed reading in the last few years is the startup post-mortem, where founders, after their company went out of business or after they decided to pull the plug, reflect on where they think things went wrong. And one of the things that a lot of these people say is, I wish we had talked to our customers or end users sooner. We got carried away by looking for funding, building our product, but we were building something that nobody wanted.
We often think great startups are built with brilliant ideas, but what if they are actually built through great conversations? Today's guest has spent years researching exactly that, how language, storytelling, and feedback shape the journey from an idea to a venture. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of School to Startup, brought to you by Tracxn, a private market intelligence platform that's been supporting the global university ecosystem for over 12 years. Through our university partnerships, we work with institutions driving innovation and entrepreneurship, and this series highlights the academic leaders making that happen. I'm Harish, your host today. I'm delighted to welcome Ruben, Senior Lecturer in Entrepreneurship at Base Business Group. Ruben, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Great. Let's start at the beginning. What first sparked your interest in entrepreneurship, and what eventually led you to, academy?
Right. So I just happened to end up in entrepreneurship is the honest answer. I was a master's student back in Amsterdam. I'm from the Netherlands, writing my dissertation, and I was convinced that after graduating, I would become a management consultant in Amsterdam. So my dissertation also focused on how management consultants convince their clients that their advice is, the right course of action. So I was already focusing on language, but not at all on entrepreneurship. Towards the end of my dissertation project, my supervisor said, I feel you enjoy doing research. Have you ever considered doing a PhD? I had not, but he happened to have a PhD proposal that focused on the language use of early stage startup entrepreneurs. And me, having always been interested in language and communication, sounded interesting. So I decided to apply, entered the PhD program in Amsterdam, and started studying entrepreneurs, knowing very little about entrepreneurship. My father had a business, but I never really talked to him about, the business side of things. So through the PhD program, I started learning a lot more about the startup world. One of the first things I did towards the end of my first year was join a startup incubator in Amsterdam as an observer, as a researcher. And that's how I slowly start to learn a lot more about entrepreneurship and really enjoyed being a sort of passive part of that community. Because what I enjoyed a lot was that in the early stages, everyone's in there to build something new. Everyone is excited, everyone's happy to help each other. And that was a very contagious atmosphere. So that's how I entered, and that's how I slowly ended up where I am now, still researching entrepreneurship and also teaching it to all types of students that we have here at Base.
Very interesting. You've also spent years studying entrepreneurs. So have you ever been tempted to start a company yourself?
I have definitely been tempted and been thinking about it. And I've also been asked that question a lot of times by people I meet, and when I tell them I do research on entrepreneurship, or by students in the classroom who ask, have you got a company yourself? And the answer has always been no. And I always think it would be good and valuable at some point to also have that first-hand experience myself. but the right time or the right opportunity hasn't arrived yet for me. At this stage, I feel I really enjoy doing what I am doing now. I believe I can say relevant things in the classroom and in research about entrepreneurship, also from a sort of third person perspective, but never say never.
Understood. So most people believe entrepreneurship starts with a great idea, but your research suggests it often starts much earlier with conversation. So what made you focus on language and communication in entrepreneurship?
Language is something I've always been very interested in, particularly how people use language to get other people to do what they want them to do. I studied a undergraduate or bachelor in political science back in the Netherlands before I did that master's in consulting I mentioned earlier. And I've always been fascinated by how politicians very cleverly use language to justify their decisions or avoid difficult questions from journalists. I've always found that fascinating, even early on. So the language focus has always been there. And so when I started my PhD, I kept focusing on that. And what I found interesting, particularly in studying early stage entrepreneurs, is that language there is extremely important for them. Because in those early days, they have an idea, but the idea might not be fully formed yet. They don't have much to show, right? They don't have a product. They might not even have a prototype of a product. So to tell other people, to show other people what is happening, they really have to explain it to them in words. They have nothing that they can show. So language is essential there, really. And I found it fascinating to understand how they use that language to talk about something that doesn't really exist yet, definitely is not yet successful, but still they need support from other people. So they need to be convincing in one way or another. And that's how I first got into studying language in entrepreneurship.
Interesting. You've also studied investor pitches in great detail. So if you had to give one piece of advice to a first-time founder preparing for their first investor meeting, what would it be?
Great question. The main bit of advice, and I realize this sounds generic, but I've seen it go wrong many times when I observed investor meetings as a researcher, is that realize who you are talking to. One thing a lot of entrepreneurs, and I think that applies to other people in other professions as well, is that they are really excited about what they're doing. So they might be tempted to talk in detail about what excites them, might say everything they can think of about all the specifications and features, the technical details of whatever it is that they are building, because that's what they are passionate about. Many entrepreneurs are technical people who come into entrepreneurship from that angle. And what I have learned and seen a lot is that you're not really meant to be doing that because you need that other person's support. So you need to think about what's in it for them. What is your audience really interested in? And if it's an investor meeting, the audience is not interested in buying your product. The audience is interested in buying a share in your company. So they will want to see where the company is going to go rather than all the little cool details of your product. So that's a mindset change that I saw a lot, including in the incubator in Amsterdam that I studied during my PhD, where the more technical founders really had to start changing the way they spoke, speaking more about the grand vision that they wanted to realize with their company and how that would help people and also generate income. So it's basic advice, but it's, I think, a very important bit of advice because many entrepreneurs, like all of us, get carried away into the details of the product. And I can say a bit more about how they learn to speak if you want, but I'll leave it at the end for now.
Interesting. And another area you have researched extensively is mentor feedback. Right? So founders usually receive advice from so many people. How should they decide which feedback to follow and which to ignore?
Well, it was interesting. What I studied were very early feedback meetings between startup entrepreneurs and people who were introduced to them as their potential mentors. So the feedback here was a very specific context, feedback that you receive from someone you have never met before in your life, which is a special type of feedback. Because a lot of the feedback that people tend to listen to is feedback given to them by people that they trust and have known for a very long time, because they know everything about you. They know what kind of message that you're more likely to listen to. But in this situation, that previous relationship was not there. These were people who had never met each other before. And I sat there next to them when they were having these feedback conversations. And many of those conversations were quite awkward, to be honest, because the people didn't really connect to each other. And what I found out when I started analyzing all the recordings of those conversations was that the way in which feedback was delivered really helped. So I looked at the extent to which the entrepreneur was agreeing with the feedback, or even saying, oh, that's an amazing bit of advice. I never thought about that before. Or proposed meeting that person again as the sort of measure of success. And I found that those things were happening more often if the mentor did not only give solicited advice. So lots of entrepreneurs were asking for advice. And if the mentor only gave the entrepreneur the advice that they asked for, the entrepreneur seemed less excited. So they wanted a little bit more than just what they asked for. But on the other side, they also didn't want to be surprised. So I also saw that there was less excitement when the mentor very abruptly gave advice that the entrepreneur didn't ask for. For example, they were talking about the business model, and suddenly the mentor would say something like, oh, I really don't like the user interface of your app. So the entrepreneur, there was no link between those two topics. The entrepreneur seemed surprised and not very interested. So that there needed to be a mix between asking something and then giving unasked for advice related to that original topic. That's what made the entrepreneurs most excited, and that really helped. In addition to that, I also found that the mentors needed to show interest in the entrepreneur. There were lots of mentors who were acting as the expert, which they were, and never asking any questions from the entrepreneur, which is interesting because the mentor, of course, was an expert in a particular domain, but did not know the entrepreneur's business. It was the first time they met. So some of the mentors were giving very general advice. And I found that the mentors who sometimes moved away from their position as the main expert and say, okay, tell me a little bit more about what you're doing, so they could customize their advice. That was also really welcome. But surprisingly, a lot of mentors did not do that, and they were not liked very much by the entrepreneurs.
Interesting. And zooming out a bit and focusing on Bay's business school. Bay's has a strong reputation for entrepreneurship. What makes the entrepreneurial ecosystem at Bay's unique for students now?
Thank you. Yeah, I think at Bay's we do quite a lot of entrepreneurship related activities. One is that we expose a lot of our students to entrepreneurship. Of course, we have specific entrepreneurship programs like a master's in entrepreneurship. But even people who don't study entrepreneurship specifically, they often get at least one class on entrepreneurship to introduce them to the idea. Because we believe that if you go on to a corporate job, it would still be good to have an entrepreneurial mindset, think in creative ways, even if you're never planning to start your own business. So as a skill, we want to give that to as many of our students as possible. In addition to that, we have our own entrepreneurship hub as part of the university, which is called City Ventures. And one thing that they do, which I really like, is that they see their programs as a funnel. At the end, you have the students who have already decided that they want to become an entrepreneur and they already have an idea. So the support that they get is a sort of incubator-like support. But at the start of the funnel, you might have people who have never heard about entrepreneurship, never thought about entrepreneurship, or don't think it is for them. So they need to be introduced in different ways to entrepreneurship related skills. So what we do at the start of the funnel there is focus more on creativity and innovation or other entrepreneurship skills that are important, like resilience or dedication. And then maybe once people at that end of the funnel have learned about these things, they get interested and they think, oh, I actually want to learn a little bit more about setting up my own business. So slowly they move away. If they don't, it's perfectly fine, but at least they still have learned some skills related to creativity and innovation. But that way we try to have support for people who are at all different points in their thought process related to entrepreneurship.
Interesting. And coming back to your research, a couple of research projects that you are currently working on caught my eye. The first is something called speed dating for entrepreneurs. So can you tell us what it's about and what you are hoping to discover?
Yes, definitely. So I studied a speed dating, or actually multiple speed dating events that were organized for early stage entrepreneurs by an entrepreneurship support organization here in London. And the idea was that during one evening, those entrepreneurs could meet as many investors as they liked. And these entrepreneurs were often not yet at the stage where they could be invested in. They were more at the idea stage. So it was mostly meant for them to learn about what investment is and what it can do for them. So I recorded a lot of the conversations just to see what entrepreneurs get out of those conversations. And I found massive differences. Some entrepreneurs, all they got out of the conversation was the investor's opinion about whether their company was ready to be funded. And because these were all early stage entrepreneurs, most often the answer was, it's a little bit too early, we're not going to be funding you. Whereas other entrepreneurs, they got a lot more out of the conversation. For example, some feedback or advice or useful connections that were given to them by the investor. So with that being so different, I started looking at what happened during those conversations that may have caused those differences in terms of what people got out of them. And I noticed that there were major differences in how entrepreneurs approached these speed dates. And you could almost make a parallel to romantic dating. If you would go on a romantic date with someone who only talks about themselves, probably you wouldn't have a future together. Yet in these business speed dates, there were many entrepreneurs who believed that they were meeting an investor. So what do you do when you meet an investor? You pitch, and you pitch nonstop, and you don't ask any questions. So most of the time, these entrepreneurs, they filled up the whole time for the speed date just talking about themselves. And then towards the end, the investor had 20 seconds to say, thank you very much. It sounds very great, but it's too early for us. Nice to meet you. Bye. So that's one strategy that some people used. Another thing that's also kind of a parallel with romantic dating is that you would want, even in a conversation where both people speak, you would want the other person to ask questions of you, to show a little bit of interest rather than just exchanging anecdotes. So that was another thing I observed, that a lot of the early stage entrepreneurs, did not necessarily do that. Maybe they didn't pitch the whole time. They stopped after a few minutes and then let the investor introduce their job and their role. But then they again went back to talking about themselves or sharing an anecdote related to funding, rather than using the opportunity to say, hey, I'm talking to an expert in the world of startup finance. Maybe this person can give me a tip on how I should get my company ready to be more fundable in the future. So there were very different approaches to these dates, which led to very different outcomes. And that's what this new project is focusing on.
Very interesting. The other project explores the well-being of people working in unicorn startups. So when people hear unicorn, they usually imagine success and excitement. So what's the reality you have been uncovering?
Yes, so another new project focuses on well-being of unicorn employees. And this is the first one of my research projects that doesn't focus on language so much. What we've been doing here is focusing in on a few UK-based unicorns and talking to employees about their experiences and also reading online reviews written by employees about these companies. And what we noticed is that a lot of people get attracted to unicorns by stories about high growth, fast change, exciting jobs, lots of opportunities. And then when they get there, not everyone is prepared or understands what to expect, because even though all of that can be positive, there's also a flip side. It often also means that there is chaos, uncertainty, projects may be terminated at any time, these kinds of things. And what we looked at was how that impacts people. So this chaos is sort of something that always happens in many fast-growing companies, but some then decide to sort of tame the chaos a little bit by setting up more formal processes and by turning their unicorn startup into more of an established business. And they do that to different degrees. We focus specifically on HR policies. And we noticed that a lot of these unicorns, they emphasized heavily performance management. That was an HR policy that was developed to top standards. They were tracking how well everyone was doing, measuring them, rewarding them, or firing them if they didn't meet the standards. But at the same time, other parts of HR were not really developed. So even though there were these high standards that were closely monitored, people were barely being trained or onboarded or prepared for their work. So for these employees, when they entered, they were surprised. They thought, why is there such a misbalance in the way HR is organized? I'm expected to do all these things, but I have no idea how to do them. And my colleagues don't have time to help me because they're all too busy and they're all too scared to be fired because they also have to work hard to meet their own targets. So which made some of these growing companies into a very difficult place to work for certain employees. And our thinking is that is because they are growing so fast. They don't have time to do it all properly because that would slow them down. So they focus on the bits that, can be helpful for them so that they can keep up the speed of growth. And then if that means that some people don't enjoy their work or don't meet standards and get fired, that's how it is, because they have a bigger goal, which is maintaining their unicorn status, the next round of funding, growing even faster, maybe an IPO. So those were our main findings, or for now, for this project.
Amazing. And finally, what one piece of advice you would give every student who is dreaming of starting a company?
The main piece of advice I would give to students is consider it, but always be sure that you talk to people before you invest too much time, effort, and money. Pretty much the approach that is advocated by the lean startup. And even though that makes a lot of sense, there are still lots of entrepreneurs who realize that their company may have failed because they didn't do it. One genre of story that I've enjoyed reading in the last few years is the startup post-mortem, where founders, after their company went out of business or after they decided to pull the plug, reflect on where they think things went wrong. And one of the things that a lot of these people say is, I wish we had talked to our customers or end users sooner. We got carried away by looking for funding, building our product, but we were building something that nobody wanted. So that is something that in my teaching and in informal conversations with students, I always really try to emphasize, make sure you speak to people. And that is a lot of hard work, and it's uncomfortable because a lot of people might tell you that they are not really interested in what you're building. But I think it's a critical step.
Very well said. Before we wrap up, where can our audience learn more about your research and follow the exciting work you're doing?
People could check out my LinkedIn and follow me there. And also, I always keep my Google Scholar profile up to date. So all my recent published work is collected on my page there.
Perfect. All the links will be available on the comment section. Great. This is a fascinating conversation I had in recent times. Today, we learned that entrepreneurship isn't just about having a great idea. It's about how you communicate, learn from the feedback, and build trust from the very beginning. Ruben, thank you so much for sharing your insights and for being part of School to Startup. It was a pleasure having you with us today.
Thank you, Harish. I enjoyed talking about this.
Great. And to everyone watching, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our future conversations with inspiring leaders from the world of entrepreneurship. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next episode.